starts its business day. Again, stay tuned as close to C-SPAN. Not only for that, we'll have a couple of hearings of interest for you as well. Today, the House will meet 10 o'clock for morning hour and legislative business. If you're interested in the voting process, those votes will take place about 1:30 this afternoon. We now go to the House of Representatives.
The House will be in order. The Chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., February 4th, 2014. I hereby appoint the Honorable John J. Duncan, Jr. to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 7th, 2014, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes. But in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're used to a world with gloomy news regarding the jarring impact and threats of climate change. We're experiencing wildfires in the Pacific Northwest this winter. The snowpack is a small percentage of normal, which is not just bad news for skiers now. It means lower river levels in the spring that will affect hydropower production, irrigation for farmers, and further damage to every troubled fish runs. California is experiencing its worst drought in 500 years. Not really man-made, as some of my Republican California colleagues claim, although it is interesting, as pointed out in the L.A. Times yesterday in an editorial. Isn't it funny that folks who question man's ability to affect climate change are so quick to assign human causes to the drought? There are severe strains on the Colorado River Basin and the 40 million people heavily dependent on that water throughout the Southwest. Last week we heard about the massive penguin die-off due to changing weather patterns. Of course, we've been experiencing the polar vortex and wild weather this winter. With all these bad signs, it was interesting to see a positive message emerge. It was featured yesterday on the front page of the Washington Post about air pollution in China. To be sure, Chinese pollution still threatens with the most carbon emissions on the planet, which portend far worse climate problems in the future for everyone. It causes 1 million premature deaths a year in China, and in fact threatens the health of West Coast Americans as we regularly breathe Chinese pollution that follows across the ocean. But it's encouraging that China is taking steps to acknowledge the problem, to track and publicize the severe pollution levels when 5 years ago they asked the United States Embassy in Beijing to stop publishing that same embarrassing data. Now the Chinese government is not just publishing the information itself and even ranking the worst offenders. The 10 most polluted Chinese cities have air quality levels 6 to 10 times the pollution of the 10 worst American cities. The Chinese are providing real-time disclosure of pollution that is more ambitious than anything the United States did in the EPA's highly successful toxic release inventory that dates back almost 30 years. It's absolutely critical that China acknowledge the problem and hold people accountable for the pollution. But it's even better news that the Chinese are going beyond mere data collection as they unveiled a $280 billion plan to improve air quality, including limiting coal use and banning high-pollution vehicles. Isn't it ironic that the leadership in the House of Representatives of the Republicans is determined to prevent the United States EPA in taking the next steps to clean up our dirty coal plants and protecting us from the carbon pollution that's causing such climate disruption, all the while denying the science? One hopes that the United States will come to its senses while it appears the Chinese are starting to come around. The future of the planet for our children and grandchildren depends upon it.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Ross Leighton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I rise this morning to recognize Alexander Montessori School for 50 years of providing exceptional educational opportunities for generations of children in South Florida. 50 years ago, Beverly McGee founded Alexander Day School in honor of her parents, Alice and Henry Alexander, in order to provide an early childhood facility for her 2 children. From the outset, her school has enjoyed a reputation as a place where kids wanted to learn and where the staff and teachers cared about what they did. Within a few years of the school's founding, Beverly became aware of what is known as the Montessori method. Named for Maria Montessori, her teaching philosophy was to foster in children a desire to think independently and be creative. Its environment maximizes independence and includes a strong focus on communication and self-molding for young students. Beverly became certified as a preschool Montessori teacher and renamed her school Alexander Montessori School. She gathered teachers from around her who shared her passion and dedication for providing a quality and caring Montessori environment for children, ones with only the highest standards of excellence. From modest beginnings of that single kindergarten class, Alexander Montessori School has grown to be one of the largest and most renowned Montessori schools in the country. Today in South Florida, Alexander Montessori schools have 2 toddler environments, 9 children's houses, and an elementary campus. These are centers where children lead the way, follow their natural talents, and fall in love with learning. An attitude summed up in its motto, to learn, to love, to learn. This independent school remains the only fully accredited American Montessori Society school in our community and one of only 10 throughout the state of Florida. I can relate to Beverly's story, her spirit, and her relentless dedication to provide children with high-quality education. I'm a former Florida certified teacher and founded and was principal of a small private bilingual school in Hialeah. I know the challenges faced by our educators as well as the positive impact that an amazing teacher can have on a young mind. And I'm a product of the South Florida school system. I graduated from West Miami Middle School and then Southwest Miami High School. I have an Associate of Arts degree from Miami-Dade College, a Bachelor and Master's degree from Florida International University in Education, and as an older adult, I completed a doctorate in education from the University of Miami. So I'm very grateful for the support that I received while I was in school, and I'm certain that I would not be the same person without this support. So ensuring that our children have the same access to a comprehensive education has become a top priority of mine. Our students deserve the best that we can offer them, and that is why I continue to work with strong partners like Alexander Montessori School to constantly improve our school system. Education is the key to self-empowerment, and teachers like those at Alexander Montessori School are giving our students the tools they need to develop and to excel. Teachers have the power to inspire and to open whole new horizons to our youth, setting them up on a positive path with high hopes and expectations for the future. for the professionalism and care that Beverly and everyone at Alexander Montessori School have shown in the pursuit of this most noble of professions. I thank each and every one of them. They have shaped the lives of so many students over the last 50 years, and we are truly privileged to have such wonderful individuals taking on this rewarding work in South Florida. Thank you again, and congratulations on a half-century of great work. Good luck in the years to come. And Mr. Speaker, I kindly ask for unanimous consent so that the names of the remarkable team members at Alexander Montessori School be entered in the congressional record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back the balance of her time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to call on my colleagues to join in the effort to pass the Fair Minimum Wage Act and raise the federal minimum wage to $10.10 an hour. 50 years ago, 200,000 Americans marched on Washington. Appealing to the soul of the nation, Dr. Martin Luther King and his fellow speakers charted out the long journey for equality and justice ahead. In a pamphlet promoting the March on Washington, they listed 10 specific legislative demands. A number of these demands would go on to become some of the most significant achievements of the federal government in the post-war era. Comprehensive civil rights legislation, desegregation of all school districts, an end to discrimination in federal housing programs. It is clear that we have made progress on many of these issues, but for many of us here, the fight for these goals remains unfinished. Let us not forget, though, that the March on Washington was actually called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Let us remember number 8 on that list of demands, and I quote, "A national minimum wage that will give all Americans a decent standard of living. Government surveys show that anything less than $2 an hour fails to do this," end of quote. On the whole, the American economy has made tremendous strides in the last half-century. Many in this Congress have been benefactors of that growth. But the American worker has been left behind. The $2 an hour that Dr. King and his colleagues called for would be nearly $15 per hour today when adjusted for inflation. Despite this fact, many of my colleagues will call the demand for a $10.10 federal minimum wage unreasonable. Many will even say this demand for a reasonable wage is rooted in partisan politics. But, Mr. Speaker, this reasonable demand is rooted in the belief that American workers deserve more. President Truman said that minimum wage legislation was, quote, founded on the belief that full human dignity requires at least a minimum level of economic sufficiency and security. The call for a raise in the minimum wage is based on the fact that while a single parent making minimum wage earns $15,080 annually, that is still more than $400 below the federal poverty rate. The call for a raise in the minimum wage is based on the fact that working 40-hour weeks, 52 weeks a year, that parent still struggles to feed their family. Think about that during your next vacation. The call for a raise in the minimum wage is based on the fact that a single parent is overwhelmingly likely to be a single mother, because while women make up 47% of our workforce, they represent nearly 2/3 of minimum wage earners. And finally, the call for a raise in the minimum wage is based on good economics. I know full well that those opposed to a raise in the minimum wage say that any raise will reduce employment, and at a certain point it could. But a modest raise to $10 an hour is nowhere near this theoretical tipping point, and more than 6 dozen economists agree. In a recent letter to Congress, they explicitly said, increases in the minimum wage have little or no impact on the employment of minimum wage workers, even during times of weakness in the labor market. The economic recovery has been long, slow, and a very long, slow road for low-wage American workers, and a raise in the minimum wage is the jolt our economy needs. Higher wages quickly turn into increased spending quickly turns into growth. But minimum wage legislation, like unemployment insurance, is merely the minimum we should be doing for the American worker. Let's remember that during the March on Washington, the demand directly preceding the call for an increase in the minimum wage was demand number 7, a massive federal program to train and place workers on meaningful and dignified jobs at decent wages. This body needs to turn its focus on advancing legislation that will create more American jobs and policies that matter to American workers. I urge my colleagues to support the American worker. Join me in calling for jobs legislation and a reasonable raise of the federal minimum wage. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We deal with a lot of very important issues in this body. In fact, everybody that's going to speak this morning is going to speak about some very important issues. But I would argue that there is no issue more important that we deal with in this body than the issue of American global leadership and the issue of national defense. I just got back from a security summit in Munich, and I want to share some of my thoughts in talking to our allies and talking to strategic partners around the globe. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a decline of American leadership around the globe. There's a perception that America is on the retreat from the rest of the world, America that's tired of a decade of war, which I fully understand, an America that decides the fight is just not worth it anymore. And the decline of American leadership around the world is not just something that we can't do because it's not good, but it's dangerous, not just to us, but to the rest of the globe. Let's think about how we got in this position in the first place. It was the failure of American leadership through the 90s to pursue a terrorist jihadist by the name of Osama bin Laden. Instead, this nation and the president treated him as a common criminal and not as a declared opponent and a war opponent of the United States of America. What we saw was an attack on the World Trade Centers, attack on the USS Cole, attack on the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, and then finally it culminated in an attack that took 3,000 American lives and woke America up to the reality of global jihadism and terrorism and the fact that we have people that live solely for the purpose of killing and destroying people that don't see eye to eye with their specific religious ideology. Failure to confront those terrorists in the 1990s led to that big problem we have today, and what we've seen lately is the same kind of retrenchment by the United States of America, undoubtedly still the most powerful country in the world. Our enemies no longer fear us, and our allies no longer trust us. Let me label a few of these areas that have concerned me. In Iraq, I'm a veteran of Iraq. The U.S. Marines actually fought to take the city of Fallujah and took the most casualties that they've taken probably since Khe Sanh in Vietnam. Today, the black flag of al-Qaeda flies over Fallujah. The sacrifice of thousands of Americans is now being confronted by the black flag of al-Qaeda because this president, eager to achieve a campaign promise, pulled all the troops out at the end of 2011 and didn't leave a residual force. As unpopular as it may be, if we left a counterterrorism force in Iraq, we would not be facing this problem today. I look at a terrible deal that was just struck with Iran, a deal that basically says Iran is allowed to be a threshold nuclear state. Sure, the Secretary, the President, will say that we're going from 20% enrichment to 5%. Doesn't mention that bringing 5% enrichment to weapons-grade enrichment actually doesn't take that long. And oh, by the way, now all the surrounding states to Iran think that they, and probably feel totally entitled to saying that they have a right to enrich uranium up to 5%. In essence, creating a whole host of Middle East threshold nuclear states. And yet we call this a victory? I look at Syria, 11,000 opponents to Assad, tortured and murdered and labeled with numbers, 11,000 people, which made Srebrenica, the thing that launched America to intervene in Bosnia, makes Srebrenica look small. 11,000 opponents to Assad tortured and killed. And you look at Assad, who's purposely targeting the Free Syrian Army and not al-Qaeda opposition, so that al-Qaeda opposition grows to him, and he can stand in front of the West and say, I am the protector. If we get to a point where we look at Assad, a brutal dictator in Syria, as the protector of freedom, God help us. I look at instability in Lebanon. I look at one of our greatest allies, Jordan, hosting hundreds of thousands of refugees. I look at Israel surrounded by instability in the Middle East. I look at a resurgent China that challenges America all over the globe now. And I look at a Russia that continues to occupy a third of its neighbor to the south, Georgia. I look at Ukraine, people standing up for freedom. Haven't heard much from this administration. I am burdened by this lack of American global leadership. I don't care about the politics of it. I don't care about November with this. I care about the future of this country. And what I see is the decline of American leadership, still the greatest country around the globe. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My friend from Illinois is right. There is a decline in American leadership, but it's not overseas. Not at all. It's here at home. Since the 1970s, American workers have seen their wages fall or stagnate. The wealthiest American incomes, however, have increased fourfold. Even after 40 years of economic growth, today's generation takes home less than its grandparents did, and high school graduates make 40% less than their predecessors did 4 decades ago. This problem ought to elicit bipartisan concern, yet many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have shown little or no interest in the consequences of our country becoming so sharply divided by wealth. For many of my Republican colleagues, even talking about it is uncomfortable. It's time to realize that all too many Americans, hard-working Americans, are falling behind. From 1979 to 2007, wages for the top 1% grew 156%, while the bottom 90% of us saw our wages grow only 17%. Since 1983, 75% of the growth in wealth has been captured by the top 5%, while the bottom 60% actually suffered a net decline. By 2010, nearly all middle and low-income families have made the same hourly wage they did in 2000, despite having raised productivity during that time period by 22%. That's not how it's supposed to work. Worse, median family income was 6% lower. But this lost decade only caps a trend that's been going on in this country for over 30 years. In what may be the most telling portrait of how middle and low-income Americans are being shut out of the new economy, Bloomberg recently reported that 95% of wealth generated since the Great Recession went to the richest 1%. 95% went to 1%. In real terms, 9 out of 10 people control less wealth than they did before the crash. In 2012, the top 10% of earners took home more than half of the U.S. total income. This is the highest level ever recorded. Income and wealth haven't been this concentrated since before the Great Depression, and we're beginning to rival the Gilded Age of the late 19th century. A recent Gallup poll shows that concerns about inequality have moved beyond academia and into the public consciousness. According to Gallup, 2 out of 3 Americans are dissatisfied with income and wealth distribution in the United States, including 54% of all Republicans and 70% of independents. The same poll found that many Americans now worry about their ability to find future opportunity, and only 54% believe that one can get ahead by working hard. What does that say about the American dream? Justice Louis Brandeis once said, "We may have democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of the few, but we cannot have both." Letting a generation of Americans remain underemployed, underpaid, and despairing about their future creates a dangerous cycle of economic and social destruction, and it damages democracy. Nations whose citizens believe that the game is rigged against them are not beacons of democracy. Civic culture corrodes, and space opens for divisive and extreme politics. We've seen that here at home. The new Pope, Pope Francis, recently lamented that the world's inequality is quietly undermining social and political institutions. He gets it. Last week, the President highlighted how our nation's wealth and income gaps have become too large to continue to ignore. Congress cannot continue to stand idly by. I urge my colleagues to consider the many bipartisan proposals that would jumpstart growth for all Americans. We need to be investing in this country's crumbling infrastructure. My own Put America Back to Work Act, which would reauthorize Build America Bonds programs, would give local governments another tool to jumpstart the economy and infrastructure projects. Generations of Americans, starting with our founders, made their way to America's shores, attracted by the promise of opportunity and the belief that through hard work they could get ahead. Unfortunately, that dream is at risk today. I urge my colleagues to join all of us in preserving opportunity for all Americans and prevent our nation from becoming a nation of stark divide between the haves and the have-nots. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his State of the Union address last week, the President described an economy in which inequality has deepened and upward mobility has stalled. Unfortunately, in many respects, he's right. The poor are worse off today than they were when President Obama took office. Nearly 7 million more Americans live in poverty today as compared to 2008. A record 47 million Americans receive food stamps, 13 million more than when President Obama assumed office. Median household income has fallen over $2,000 in the last 4 years. 76% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, and the percentage of working-age people actually in the workforce has dropped to the lowest rate in 35 years. A full 92 million Americans are not part of the labor force. They're either unemployed or not even actively looking for work. They're so frustrated with the Obama economy, they've just given up. When taking into account marginally attached workers, workers who are unemployed but want a job, workers who have part-time jobs who want full-time jobs, the jobless rate today is over 13%. Mr. Speaker, 5 years after this president took office, the State of the Union is not strong. But instead of admitting that his policies have failed, the president offered more big government and more class warfare. But, Mr. Speaker, a lack of government isn't the problem, and class warfare isn't a solution. The president says we need to raise the minimum wage, extend emergency unemployment insurance yet again for the 13th time in his administration. But we should stop thinking small in this country. We're Americans. We should think big. We don't need minimum wages. We need maximum wages. We don't need more unemployment insurance and government dependency. We need jobs and self-sufficiency. The best way to combat income inequality, to restore upward mobility and the American dream, and create a healthy economy, is for Washington to get out of the way, whether in the doctor's office, in the job market, or at the gas pump. That means replacing Obamacare with patient-centered reforms that will lower the cost of health care without growing government. It means cutting wasteful spending and making reforms to put the nation on a path towards a balanced budget. It means comprehensive tax reform that rewards work, saving, and investment and allows individuals, families, and businesses to keep more of what they earn. It means rolling back provisions of Dodd-Frank that allow bureaucrats to take away choices, financial services and products, and limit access to credit and take those away from the American people. It means unleashing the energy potential of the United States by ending the war on coal and approving immediately the Keystone Pipeline. And it means giving the poor a hand up rather than a handout, giving them a job instead of a government check, and giving them the skills they need to escape dependency so that they can achieve their God-given potential. We can do all of this. We can restore the American dream. We can restore opportunity and economic growth. And I stand ready to work to get America back on track. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Alabama, Ms. Sewell, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise
in honor of Black History Month and the countless contributions and sacrifices made by notable African Americans to this great nation. I also stand before you to proclaim the month of February as a time of reflection for Alabama's 7th Congressional District. In honor of Black History Month, I thought it would be befitting that we pay honor and tribute to the native sons and daughters of Alabama that have made significant contributions not only to the great state of Alabama, but to this nation. As representative of the Civil Rights District and a beneficiary of the sacrifices of so many, I have committed to sharing the stories of these extraordinary men and women throughout the month of February so that their contributions will forever be recorded and referenced in our nation's history. Today I begin with a tribute to Virgil Ware, 13, and Johnny Robinson, 16. These American heroes and Birmingham natives lost their lives within hours of the historic bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church on Sunday, September 15, 1963. While many of us have heard the heart-wrenching stories of the 4 little girls that perished in that bomb, many aren't aware that on that same day, Virgil and Johnny were also victims of unspeakable and senseless violence. Virgil Ware was born on December 6, 1949 in Birmingham, Alabama, to James and Lorraine Ware. He was the 3rd of 6 children. One of his surviving brothers, Melvin Ware, describes Virgil as a special child who was exceptional in his educational endeavors. While his brothers were preparing for social gatherings, Virgil could be found reading a good book or perusing the encyclopedia. A few months before his death, the 8th grader expressed to his older siblings that he was looking forward to joining them at the local high school next year. But before Virgil's dreams could be realized, he fell victim to a tragedy that would change the Ware family and this community forever. Virgil, who sat on the handlebars of his brother's bike, was headed to join his brother on a paper route on the outskirts of Birmingham, Alabama, on Sunday, September 15, 1963. The brothers rode past a group of men who had just left a segregationist meeting in the city. One of the men was told to shoot at the Ware brothers to scare them. The man fired 2 shots in their directions. One bullet struck Virgil in his chest and another in his cheek. Tragically, the young boy that loved to read and help his family lost his life on that day. Virgil was the 6th young person to lose his life on that Sunday in Birmingham due to blatant violence. Just 1 hour prior to Virgil's death, Johnny Robinson joined a group of young boys at a local gas station. Johnny was born on February 25, 1947, to Martha and Johnny Robinson Sr. His younger brother, Leon, describes him as a kid that loved playing baseball and basketball. Ironically, his favorite subject was history, and even at the tender age of 16, he understood that he and his siblings were living in a historic era. He came from a close-knit family and had lost his father in racially motivated killing just weeks before his own death. The afternoon that Johnny went to the gas station, tensions remained high as local citizens were still reeling from the news of the church bombing and the deaths of the 4 little girls. According to accounts that were published in the Birmingham News article, Johnny and the other young boys were being taunted by white teenagers with chants of opposing integration. There was also reports of rocks being thrown in retaliation. And hours after the bombing, in the midst of all the chaos, Johnny was killed by a police officer. Some of our nation's biggest heroes are those that fought on the front lines in pursuit of equality and justice. However, young Virgil and Johnny serve as symbols of the heroes of the movement that we don't always recognize. Johnny and Virgil should be remembered for their important sacrifices that were made, and this history of our nation should not forget them. As we celebrate Black History Month and the notable contributions of African Americans to this country, I ask my colleagues to join me in remembering these brave young men during the month of February and beyond. Their short lives serve as one of many catalysts for the transformative change in our country. While we know that their destinies were cut short, far too short, we remember them for their impact on the civil rights movement. During their short time on this earth, these young souls should be counted in the number of our nation's biggest heroes.
And I hope that my colleagues will join me in celebrating the life and legacy of Virgil Ware and Johnny Robinson, Jr. during this Black History Month period. Thanks.
Time of the gentlewoman has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, today, February 4, is World Cancer Day. It's a day we remember those lost to this disease while recommitting ourselves and our efforts to eradicating it. This World Cancer Day, people across the globe will speak out in one unified voice in hopes of improving knowledge about cancer and its symptoms while shattering the stereotypes and misconceptions that stand as barriers to the treatment. By debunking the myths and bringing the fight against cancer to the global stage, we can make meaningful strides to address an issue that touches individuals, families, and communities worldwide. This year alone, 1.6 million Americans will be diagnosed with cancer, and many of them will be children. As a member of the Childhood Cancer Caucus and a cancer survivor myself, I know how important it is to support each one of those cases with dedication and with care. So today, let's recognize the thousands of oncologists, support staff, researchers, and families tackling this diagnosis from start to finish. If we work together, from government organizations like the National Institutes of Health to hospitals and cancer treatment facilities in my home state of Pennsylvania, to passing bipartisan legislation like the Gabrielle Miller Kids First Research Act, we can make this World Cancer Day a success and put an end to cancer in the not-so-distant future. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
I join with my colleague from Pennsylvania in recognizing that today, February 4th, is World Cancer Day, a day in which we raise awareness about the impacts of cancer worldwide and join forces to work together to find a cure. If America does not lead the world in cancer research, there is no leadership in cancer research in the world. A newly released report from the American Cancer Society says that the death rate from cancer has decreased by 20% over the past 2 decades. 30 years ago, less than 50% of those who were diagnosed with cancer lived beyond 5 years of their diagnosis. Today, it's 65% for adults and 80% for children. Cancer research needs to be sustained if it's to be effective. 10 years ago, 25% of all those grants that came into the National Cancer Institute were funded. Today, it's less than 8%. We're not only losing important research, but we're also losing talented researchers who leave the field because of a lack of public funding for cancer research. Historically, there were 3 ways to deal with cancer. You could cut it out through surgery, you could burn it out through radiation, or you could destroy it through toxic chemicals or chemotherapy. Chemotherapy was developed in Buffalo in 1904 at Roswell Park Cancer Institute. After those traditional cancer treatments, with some debilitating side effects, a new generation, about 15 years ago, was developed to treat cancer called targeted therapies. These are therapies that attack fast-growing cancer cells without destroying healthy cells. These targeted therapies led to promising new therapies in breast cancer, Herceptin, which was a very, very difficult, treated a very difficult cancer, late-stage cancer. Also, Gleevec, which was highly effective in treating leukemia. Today, the prestigious journal Science just declared that in 2013, the most important science discovery was something called immunotherapy. Immunotherapy uses several strategies, including vaccines, to treat the body's immune system to naturally fight cancer. What the promise is, in many clinical trials that are occurring throughout this nation, including at Buffalo's Roswell Park Cancer Institute, is longer remissions without the debilitating side effects. We have a lot to learn about cancer. It's not one disease, it's hundreds of diseases. Lifestyles plays a very important part in the incidences of cancer, both here in the country and throughout the world. 89% of all lung cancers are due to smoking. 30% of all cancers are a direct result of tobacco use. In our lifetime, 1 in every 3 women will develop invasive cancer in their lifetime. 1 in 2 men will develop invasive cancer because men smoke more. But we need to know that early detection is also important as well. Less than 10% of cancer deaths are attributed to the original tumor. It's when cancer moves, when it advances, when it metastasizes to a vital organ, is when cancer becomes lethal. The cancer cells crowd out healthy cells and render that organ, which we need to live, useless. So today, on World Cancer Day, we are reminded about all the work that has been done, all the progress that has been made, and all the progress still yet to be made. We also learned that while it's World Cancer Day, America has a unique role in the history, currently, and prospectively in developing the next generation of cancer treatments. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Roskin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in December of last year, the American Studies Association did a shameful thing. They decided to call on an academic boycott of one nation, and that is the State of Israel. Now think about that. They looked over every other country in the world and they said basically, by admission, oh, you're fine and you're fine and you're fine and you're fine. It doesn't matter what's happening there or what's happening there, but we're going to go after one country, Israel, and we're going to call upon a boycott. The former Israeli ambassador, Michael Oren, after that happened, he asked this question, and he said, will Congress stand up for academic freedom? And the answer is yes. I was pleased, Mr. Speaker, to join with 134 colleagues, myself included, to send a letter to the American Studies Association to admonish them on what is clearly an anti-Semitic effort on their part. I know that's a very harsh thing for me to say, but there's no other way to describe it. It is anti-Semitic. I intend to move forward in the coming weeks to author legislation entitled the Protect Academic Freedom Act, which will prevent these campaigns by prohibiting federal funds to universities that boycott Israeli academic institutions. Said another way, these organizations are clearly free to do what they want to do under the First Amendment, but the American taxpayer doesn't have to subsidize it. The American taxpayer doesn't have to be complicit in it. And the American taxpayer doesn't have to play any part in it. In fact, what we're doing on a bipartisan basis is calling for Congress to defend academic freedom, because we recognize that academic freedom is at its very root of our own freedom. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Barra, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to speak in opposition of H.R. 3964, the so-called Sacramento-San Joaquin Emergency Water Delivery Act. Mr. Speaker, California is suffering its worst water crisis in modern history. This is a 1 in 500-year drought. For the 3rd year in a row, dry weather conditions and drought-like conditions are hurting so many families in California, farmers, small businesses. If you need to see how bad things have gotten, look at Folsom Lake in my district. It's dry. Over 500,000 residents in my community rely on Folsom Lake as a source of its water. This is how bad it's gotten. Yeah, we're doing everything we can to conserve water, but you can't take water when it doesn't exist. And that's why H.R. 3964 is such a bad bill. It is a bill that is taking what doesn't exist. It doesn't create any new water. It just tries to move water from one community to another. But it doesn't exist. You can't take water that's not there. You know, in fact, let's show you how bad things have gotten. You know, the snowpack in California, in the Sierras, is the source of water for over 25 million Californians. It's what we rely on. It's our biggest reservoir. Now, you can see what the snowpack looked like January 2013. Here it is. You got snow right here, and that's our biggest reservoir, and this is in the middle of the drought. Here's what it looks like today. January 2014. It's not there. The snow's not there. So H.R. 3964 suggests taking water that doesn't exist. It's a bad bill. You know, you can't, falsely promise water deliveries that doesn't exist. The water's not there. Now, here's what my suggestion is to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Water's not about Democrats or Republicans. This is a solution that we have to come together. It's about protecting our communities. California is going to go through a devastating summer if we don't come together immediately as Democrats and Republicans, look at how we can conserve water, look for creative solutions on recycling water. Well, we've got to do this together, not pitting one region against another, not pitting one community against another. We have to come up with creative solutions, and we can't just look at today's challenge. We've got to do that. That's an immediate issue. But we've also got to start discussing the future of water in California, looking at issues like storage, looking at issues like water recycling, looking at creative solutions, because it's dry. With that, let's come together as Democrats and Republicans, folks from the North State and the South State, and let's not pit one community against another. Let's solve this issue today and for our children. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week the House of Representatives passed the Agricultural Act of 2014, 5-year Farm Bill reauthorization, with a bipartisan support by a vote of 251 to 166. This Farm Bill is a big win for the nation's economy and will support jobs across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania while making necessary reforms that will save taxpayers billions. Mr. Speaker, not only does this bill deliver for taxpayers, it's good public policy. We spent over 4 years crafting the measure through dozens of hearings and audits and other forums for public and stakeholder input. The bill was produced by the House-Senate Conference Committee, upon which I served, that was charged with resolving the differences between the House and the Senate-passed farm bills. Throughout this process, members of the Agriculture Committee have proved that positive movement on an important piece of legislation can be achieved. This bill repeals direct payments and limits producers to risk management tools that offer protection when they suffer significant losses. Under the measure, limits on payment are reduced, eligibility rules are tightened, and means tests are streamlined to make farm programs more accountable. The measure provides historic reforms to dairy policy by repealing outdated and ineffective dairy programs. It supports small businesses and beginning farmers and ranchers with training and access to capital. The agreement reauthorizes numerous research, extension, and education programs, including programs for land-grant universities, the National Institute of Food and Health, and the Agricultural Research Service. This Farm Bill makes the first reforms to the food stamp program since the welfare reforms of 1996, while maintaining critical food assistance to families in need. It closes the heat and eat loophole that artificially increases benefit levels when states provide nominal LIHEAP assistance. The bill also includes the Forest Products Fairness Act, a bill that I introduced which would open new market opportunities for timber and forest products by allowing them to qualify for the U.S. Department of Agriculture Biopreferred program. It contains language codifying the Forest Service's authority to categorically exclude non-controversial, day-to-day activities from the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, assessments. It provides certainty to the forest products industry by clarifying that forest roads and related silvicultural activities will not be treated as a point source of pollution under the Clean Water Act, and they will no longer be subject to frivolous lawsuits. It improves the Farm Bill conservation title through the consolidation of 23 duplicative programs into 13. Overall, the package reduces deficits by $16.6 billion over 10 years. Mr. Speaker, for family farms and agribusinesses in my home state that drive the economy with more than $68 billion in total economic activity annually, this bill is a big win. Mr. Speaker, for individuals and families in my home state that are looking for that next job or a little more take-home pay, this bill is a big win. Mr. Speaker, for the families and individuals that rely on safe and affordable food every day, this bill is a big win. Mr. Speaker, I urge the Senate to quickly pass this bill and get it to the President's desk for his signature. Americans deserve as much. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until noon today.